Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for our summit on bus priority. My name's Emma Gibson. I'm the director of London TravelWatch, and we're the official transport watchdog for Londoners and people travelling into London. And we represent you however you travel, whether you're walking, cycling, or using public transport. And this event is being held in memory of our former Deputy Chair, Ruth Thompson, to recognise a huge contribution she made to London TravelWatch's work before she sadly passed away in office in 2016. As our streets champion, she was a great advocate of the bus and the important role it played alongside cycling and walking. So today we're going to be talking about how to clear the way for the bus on London's roads. By doing so, bus passengers will be able to enjoy shorter journey times and more reliable services, which in turn will encourage more people to use the bus. And of course, we know that the main reason why more people don't use buses is that they think they're too slow and it won't get them where they need to get to on time. Apart from walking, buses are the most popular form of transport in London, so getting this right is incredibly important. Indeed, the Mayor's target of 80% of all trips in London being made on foot, by cycle or using public transport by 2041 won't be possible if bus services are reduced or if they're not made more attractive to use. In fact, we need a 40% increase in bus journeys to reach that target. So although we're here to talk specifically about the bus today, I'm really pleased that the conversation is increasingly about how walking, cycling and public transport need to complement and reinforce each other rather than compete with each other for attention. At this precise moment, we're at a time when buses are under threat if TfL can't find the funding that it needs after December the 11th. London TravelWatch is currently asking people who live or travel into London to email their MP, their London Assembly member and their councillor to ask them to help solve this problem. You can find out more information about this on our website. But back to today. In today's summit, we will reveal for the first time the financial benefits that can come from operating more efficient bus journeys. And speakers from Transport for London and the London Borough of Hackney will tell us about the importance of the bus to them. So after that, we'll have a panel question and answer session. So if you've got any questions about what you hear, you can tweet us, email us, or post a comment in the YouTube feed. The details are up on the screen at the moment. First of all, I'm going to pass you on to my colleague Trevor, who's going to launch our Day in the Life of a Bus video.
Thanks, Emma, and thank you to everyone watching for joining us this morning. My name is Trevor Rosenberg, and I'm a Policy and Advocacy Officer at London TravelWatch. To begin today's summit, we wanted to set the scene by showing what it's like on the roads for buses and their passengers. So we are proud to present our Day in the Life of a Bus video. We'd like to thank Go Ahead London for allowing us to use one of their buses, and to our filmmakers, the Ogmus School of Zen Motoring.
A moment of calm to collect our energies before we head out of the bus garage and onto the streets. Let's test our horn. Magnificent, as usual. After you, after you. Now, let's test our Zen on route number 12. Lovely fruit and veg you've got there, but you're in our way a bit. We need more room here for a bus and an ambulance to go about their important businesses. Oh no, who designed this situation? Sometimes parking is the enemy of progress. Finally back on track, and things are looking up. It's a bus filter, yes. Bye bye car, wee, beautiful. There's no better feeling. It's like bumping into an old friend. Hey, how's it going? Great to see you. Take care. I can see a potential problem ahead. Who permitted cars to park in the bus lane? It's ludicrous. Thank you, my friend, the 176, for being alert to the issue. Us buses have to stick together out here. And spread out, of course. Let's keep an eye out for cyclists. I see you. You see me? Good. I like this special road. It's a safe haven for buses and pedestrians and cyclists. The mystical blue path. I wish we were going that way. Oh dear, an inconsiderate car is blocking me. Look at all that juicy bus lane that I can't get into. Okay, let's go. It's fortunate no one is parked here, otherwise we'd be stuck again. 3, 2, 1. Off you go, cyclists. Stay safe. I would like some special lights for us too. Or maybe these kind of lights. This certainly feels like an emergency. We can't just sit around here all day. Regent Street. So much happens here in such little space. After you, my friend. Do we really need this traffic island? I'm not sure we do. It's chock-a-block. Even a golf cart can't get through. Except buses. That's one of my favorite signs. Back on Regent Street. Look at those dancing characters. So full of joy. But I'm not full of joy about this situation. This lorry shouldn't be stopping here. I'll have to skillfully maneuver around it. I see you putting your hand out, but I stop here by the post. Hey guys, there's a lorry back there that's up to mischief. Ooh, the fabled blue path. VIP coming through. I have diplomatic immunity as an ambassador of public transport. The number 12 route is a beautiful route. It's too wonderful a route to end up in quagmires like this. And I don't just speak for the number 12. I speak for the C10, the 468, the 172, the 63. We're not meant to be cooped up like this. We want to be free. Free like these birds overhead. Free to fly our routes without endless impediments. In the meantime, I guess we should just take this opportunity to test our Zen and meditate.
As we've just seen, although there are problems on the road for buses and their passengers, there are a lot of solutions, both small scale and large scale, to make things better. Big ticket items like bus lanes and bus filters make a huge impact on reducing journey times. But smaller and cheaper measures like stopping cars parking where they shouldn't have also been shown to be really effective. We will send you the link to the video after the summit. Please feel free to share it with your friends, colleagues, and anyone else you know who cares about the bus. And we ask that if you want buses to be better, please contact your councillor and join us in asking to help free the bus. London TravelWatch will also soon be launching a social media campaign to raise public awareness of the importance of making buses more reliable and to ask for more priority to be given to the bus by councils. We've seen in the video the steps that can be taken to help the bus, but there's another key argument which boosts the case for greater bus priority, and that's a financial one. After speaking with TfL, I'm pleased to now reveal the savings and additional revenue that can be made if you clear the way for the bus. But before I explain about what's possible if the way is cleared, I'd just like to recap about the problem that needs to be addressed. More Londoners use the bus than any other type of public transport, including the lowest paid and key workers who could not afford another type of public transport. But for years, the bus has had to compete with increased traffic on the road, so buses are slower than they used to be. In fact, in the 12 months before the pandemic hit, average bus speeds were only 9.3 miles per hour, the third successive year in which speeds were that slow. At that speed, by comparison, it would have been faster to travel on the back of a donkey. We know that as bus users regularly put journey time and reliability as their top priorities, it is no surprise that whilst speeds are stalling, fewer people were using the bus. Bus ridership in London declined for 6 consecutive years, down to 2.1 billion journeys in 2019-20. If the bus is given priority on our roads, journey times will get shorter and more people will use them. This would mean TfL will be able to run fewer vehicles on bus routes and save money. TfL have told us that when bus journey times are improved, routes can be completed more quickly, reducing the number of vehicles needed in service. This can have a positive cost implication. As an approximate indicator, if buses travel 1 mile per hour faster than they do now, you can potentially save between 100 and 200 million pounds per year. And it isn't only savings that are possible. It's also been calculated that if buses travel 1 mile per hour faster, it will generate additional revenue of 80 to 85 million pounds. That's because services become more attractive, which leads to an increase in passengers. And we already know what's possible from a case study at the height of the pandemic last autumn. Bus speeds in central London increased by approximately 20%. This resulted in 110 vehicles being removed from those routes. In financial terms, that would have equated to an approximate annual saving of 20 million pounds. So if the bus is loved even a bit more than it currently is, you can make savings and generate additional revenue, as well as help passengers have a better experience of using the bus. We'll share with you after the summit the full briefing page that I've just outlined.
Thank you very much, Trevor. So now I'm really pleased to introduce our speakers from Transport for London. Jeff Hobbs is the Director of Public Service Transport Planning, and Tom Cunnington is the Head of Buses Business Development. And they're going to talk to us about their new bus action plan, which is soon to be launched, and why it will be so important to making the bus more attractive to use. So over to you, Jeff.
Good morning. I'm the person at TfL who sets out all the schedules for public transport and the justification for why they are what they are, using data and computer modelling quite often in that regard. I have in front of me a few slides. There's a slide with some data and key facts. You'll see it's a big network. There are 9,000 vehicles in the fleet, and the contracted fleet. There are 19,000 bus stops. There were, before the pandemic, nearly 2.3 billion journeys every year on the network. And that public transport, of all the different types of public transport, buses were the biggest single one. They had a 14% share of all trips in London, including walking and cycling. And that doesn't really do it justice. Better perhaps is the statistic that says that over 60% of Londoners use the bus at least once a week. And that gives a measure of the importance of the bus to London. Moving on to the next slide, sets out the different responsibilities for buses in London. And you can see on the left-hand side, there's a column for Transport for London, which is responsible via people like me, about the shape and size of the network. We set the fares, we set standards for the sorts of vehicles. We put down what the timetable should be, and we maintain and build quite a lot of bus infrastructure, be that forms of bus priority or bus stations, and indeed the roads, of course, some parts of the road network. Meanwhile, the operators, they bid for routes, they recruit, train and manage a lot of staff, the day-to-day operation of the buses, and of course making sure that they meet all safety standards and run the buses day in, day out. The purpose of this is merely to say that in terms of ensuring decent speed and reliability of the bus network, it's a shared set of responsibilities. We in TfL can do a lot in terms of making sure the infrastructure is fit for purpose, but it's the operators who run the service day in, day out and it's their service control staff and their drivers in particular who can make sure that the buses run as regularly as they ever possibly can do. And there is, of course, another part of this jigsaw puzzle not mentioned on the slide, and that is the boroughs, which, of course, are the highways authority, the transport authority for many of the roads upon which buses travel. And therefore, there is a third set of responsibilities as well to make sure the buses run smoothly and journey times are minimized. If we move on to the next slide, you'll see a color-coded chart in front of you. Now, this is a graph of something called excess waiting time, and that is a measure of reliability. If excess waiting time is 0, it means the buses are running precisely to time. The intervals between each bus are exactly even. And looking at the long view, this graph starts in 1984, you can see that this has got a lot better over the years. And over recent years, it's largely been 1 minute of excess waiting time. In fact, last year, 2020, during the pandemic, that fell to an all-time low of half a minute. So really quite a lot of success over the long term, but of recent years, it's stalled a little bit, and it's fair to say with the worst of the pandemic passing, excess wait time has moved back to about 0.9 of a minute. You have to have the concept of a decimal minute there. So whilst we're doing quite well, there is quite a lot more to be done. We've all can think of times when buses haven't turned up on time or there's been long gaps, and bus priority can really help with that. Now, if we move on to the next slide, this merely repeats what Trevor has just said, that there is a very good financial business case for bus priority. On the one hand, faster buses mean reduced journey time. Reduced journey time means that the bus is more attractive to customers, more trips will be made, more fares income collected. On the other side of the equation, faster buses means that for a given timetable, you need less resource and therefore less cost. Either way round, it's a good thing. Now, those costs and those revenues all go to support a better bus service in the end. So that's just from an example of, as Trevor said, of an increase of 1 mile an hour in the bus service speed, which is exactly what we saw as it happens in 2020-21 when buses were that 1 mile an hour faster. Now that was during some pretty extraordinary circumstances, but if we could replicate that through other means, through bus priority, for example, then we would expect to see the good outcomes that are described here. If we move on to the next slide, I've got some material here to describe the nature of the means by which we could help to achieve that. First means is through traffic signals. There are all sorts of software associated with traffic signals. Some of the biggest sources of delay are at junctions. To the extent that you can get buses passing more reliably through traffic signals, then you can reduce a really material source of delay. And a lot of the junctions, a lot of traffic signals do indeed have this sort of kit. In short, the lights turn green as buses approach. The regular cycle is interrupted to enable buses to go first. We also make sure that we review the cycle times of traffic lights. They're all controlled by computer software, as I say, and there is a timing for each of the arms of each junction, from when they go from red to yellow to green and back again, and you can adjust that such that the timings are optimized for the pattern of bus services coming from each direction. And that sort of technology will save an awful lot of time and an awful lot of by extension, passengers' time and make journeys more attractive on the bus. If we go on to the next slide, that sets out a list of 6 things which are associated with this. I mentioned the signal timing reviews already. We look very hard at the patterns of usage of the bus routes as they change over time. We can do things called call cancel. It happens on occasion, particularly at pedestrian lights, that pedestrians press the button to get the green person to go across the road and then walk away. And there's technology that can detect that and cancel that to allow the traffic and the buses to continue flowing. We can prioritize particular buses which are running behind time. Each bus has kit on it, GPS kit to say where it is, and therefore we know which buses are running ahead, which ones are running behind, and which ones are on time, and we can differentially change traffic lights according to where they are in the schedule. We can also try and coordinate street works, and again they are a material source of delay. They often associated with temporary traffic lights as well, and we can try and do the same thing with that. And we also have relatively recently real-time data up at our control room to inform which buses are the ones which we want to bring forward and which ones we want to regulate such that we can even out the intervals in the bus service such that there are not excessive waits for passengers. So all those things we can do. Moving on to the next one, there's also road infrastructure, which the most familiar to many of you will be bus lanes. There are roundly 300 kilometers of bus lanes, not wholly dissimilar from 20 years ago, though it's changed a fair bit over that time. Not all bus lanes are in operation for the whole of the day. Some are just for the peaks, some of them are 24 hours, and there are various combinations in between. And there is at the moment a review of bus lanes on something called TLRN, Transport for London Road Network, which is the busy strategic roads, to see whether we should operate them for more of the day, 24 hours, in whole or in part. Moving on to the next slide, there are lots of different forms of this infrastructure. Bus lanes I've mentioned. We can all think when bus lanes, we might have been on a bus and bus lanes are blocked by parking and loading. Often the roads on which buses go down busy high streets. This is not surprising, it's where people want to go. We want to send buses to where people want to go. But it's also where there's lots of activity for freight or for people driving and parking, and they block the way for the bus in existing bus lanes. There's also things we do to have turns which are exclusively for buses, be it right turns or left turns. And we can also do things to try and make the road environment in busy town centres more friendly to the buses to enable freer movement, of which bus gates, as a picture of an example there down in the bottom right hand corner, is one. So going on to the next slide, this is all easier said than done, is the purpose of this slide, in the sense that it makes excellent business sense, but road space is limited, and it's quite a hard thing to persuade all of the people that this is the right way forward, notwithstanding the fact that buses are such a popular mode of transport. So here's an example of one which we've looked at in the past and found very difficult to do, Harrow Road in northwest London, where were one to try and enhance bus priority, there's all sorts of things that one has to do from the list of things that I mentioned above. Now, Harrow Road goes through a succession of town centres. There's a whole string of small shops, everything from hardware to fast food. Some of these shops are extremely jealous, quite rightly, of their parking and loading immediately outside, especially for reasons of fact that people come to collect things, some of which are really quite heavy, and it's deciding who has the right to any particular road space can be a judgment of Solomon. So doing all these things can be quite tricky. There's a map there which looks at the sorts of interventions that one has to make. The point being that you have to do all sorts of different things along the length of this particular road, different things in different places. But were one able to achieve it, it will make a real difference. Route 18 is London's busiest bus route. Today's fun fact for the day. And it would make a real difference to the passengers on that route, which are often subject to delay because such bus priority that is there sometimes gets blocked. If we move on to the next slide, there's a few examples of things that we've been doing recently. So the 24/7 bus lane extension, which I mentioned just very briefly at the moment, for which there's an emergency traffic order at the moment, and we're thinking hard about what the next steps are for that. There are new bus lanes. There's one at West Hill on the A3, where a lot of the traffic comes to a dead halt after running down the A3, which is a very large and big dual carriageway, and becomes a much narrower road as you approach Wandsworth. So a bus lane there is peculiarly useful. Bishopsgate, where we have changed the status of that road through effectively a bus gate, which means a bus-only stretch of road, walking and cycling as well. And that has led to all sorts of trips to the courts as a result. And signal call cancel as well, which I mentioned earlier, which can make quite a big difference. Last thing I want to say, going to my last slide, there's a chart in front of you, hopefully. We, London, are not alone in making use of various types of bus priority. And you'll see a chart there. The different cities are marked with a mere letter, A to O, anonymised as it is. But London is picked out as LN towards the right-hand side. And you'll see that we make very extensive use of the signal type of bus priority and much less of the road infrastructure. And that rather reflects London's road network, which is peculiar compared to many other cities. Go to places in North America or many other places, and you have wider streets in regular patterns, gridiron style. Ours can get wide and then get narrow in all sorts of idiosyncratic ways, and changing road space is quite difficult, as I mentioned. So rather less in terms of infrastructure, but we absolutely make the most of our traffic signal software. So they're the means of bus priority. It is a great investment where one can install it. At this point, I hand over to my colleague Tom, who will talk very briefly about some of the other ways and means by which one can drive up bus usage. Tom.
Thanks, Jeff, and good morning, everyone, and thanks to Emma and the team at London TravelWatch for inviting us to speak this morning. So my name's Tom Cunnington. I work in the bus operations team at Transport for London, and our job is, in the diagram that Jeff showed earlier on, is to manage our bus contractors in terms of awarding tenders, to manage their performance, and also to come up with and implement strategy and change initiatives across the network. So my team, for example, are involved in delivery of the bus safety standards, and a lot of our air quality work, for example, making all of our fleet Euro 6 standards, and as I'll touch on in a moment, our future work on decarbonisation. And what I really want to do is to talk about how we reset the story of buses, because I think the bus network in London has a huge strength in its red, iconic image that everyone recognises across the world. But in many cases, people kind of see that as being old and just something that's there as part of the furniture. And what we've realised we need to do is we need to reset the conversation around the importance of the bus network to Londoners as a whole and to stakeholders more widely. So some more fun facts to add to the facts we've had already from Jeff today. 70% of our most strategic bus links are on borough roads. So whilst we run some of the most busy roads in London as part of the TLRN, actually 70% of the most strategic bus links are on roads that we don't control. And if we move on to the next slide, thank you, then we can see that 62% of Londoners use the bus network at least once a week. Now that varies across London. In the best borough, it's 77%. But even in the borough with the lowest bus use, it's 45%. So in boroughs with very high car dependency, almost half of the people in the borough use the bus network at least once a week. 27% of Londoners use the bus network 5 times a week or more. And only 10% of Londoners in a pre-COVID period hadn't used the bus network in the previous 12 months. So 90% of Londoners used the bus network in the year before COVID. So I think that is to try and demonstrate how important the bus network is to Londoners, even though perhaps they're not as vocal as some other users, but how important it is. And it's what they do use the bus network for. They use it to go to work, they use it to go to school, they go to town centres to spend money in shops and at leisure to keep the economy going, and they use it to access essential services like healthcare. And even during COVID, when we were doing everything we could to dissuade people from travelling, we still had, at the lowest point, about 20% of pre-COVID numbers of people using buses. And as soon as lockdown sort of released a little bit and more essential workers started going out and about, that number increased quite rapidly. And we're back now, even with still reduced travel, to somewhere between 75 and 80% pre-COVID numbers, people using the bus network. So just to give a context of how important the network is to Londoners. And as Emma said at the beginning, a high quality bus network is front and centre as part of the Mayor's transport strategy, linked with walking and cycling, and it supports the investment in rail. Many people use the bus to access the rail network and vice versa for the last bit of the journey. Many people that cycle when they can use the bus and public transport when they don't. And if we're serious about encouraging all of the sustainable modes and enabling Londoners to have a car-free lifestyle, or perhaps a 1-car rather than a 2-car household lifestyle, we need to do everything we can do to improve all of those methods of transport in an equivalent way, and to make sure the bus network steps up and improves as well. It delivers Mayor's transport strategy goals, it delivers decarbonisation goals, and also, because of the number of people that use the network and because of the cost of the network, it's essential to delivering TfL's long-term financial sustainability. Now, as we're speaking today, it's in the context of a funding deal that runs out in just a few days' time. And we've set out in the last week or so the consequences of not having a financial settlement that supports TfL in its wider role, but particularly in the bus network. And we've talked in that context around the potential of a managed decline scenario and some really very severe bus cuts to the network. And I think that is serious, and we need to recognise that in the conversations that we have today. And it would be wrong of me not to highlight that today. And that is the worst case, we believe, of what could happen. And we think it's important to set that case out. But what I also want to talk about today, though, is to kind of set the other side of the story in the context. While the reality of a managed decline is real, if we don't get a settlement that's of the right level, buses also can make a massive change to London and continue to support all of those activities I've talked about already as well. So what we've been looking at, I guess, over the last few months during COVID and prior to that is what more can buses do to help deliver what TfL and what the Mayor wants us to do. So on the next slide, it sets out the case that we make for why the bus network is important to London, subject to funding, obviously, in all of the context here. So decarbonisation is at the top of many agendas. COP26 in the last few weeks has been a major discussion point for many people. I know my two children, who are 11 and 13, talk about the impact on the environment frequently, and it's coming up more and more amongst younger generations. And they, of course, are people that are making lifestyle choices over the next few years about where they're going to live and whether they're going to buy a car, how they're going to travel around, and so on. So those are a really important group of current and future customers and users to get to as well. So we need to do our piece in helping to reduce carbon emissions. And I think it's important at this point to call out that a zero emission bus is still much, much better than a zero emission car, because a zero emission car still contributes to congestion on the road. It might have zero carbon for the journey it takes, but it takes up more space and it uses more carbon per passenger than a bus does. So I think we need to be careful around the messaging around zero emission cars. Yes, they're better than diesel and petrol cars, but using public transport and sustainable modes is still what we need to do to go forward. We need to recognise that Londoners' travel needs continue to change. They're very, very diverse. It's really difficult to categorise a typical bus user. There are many different sort of personas of bus users, and we need to make sure that we improve the quality and the reliability to attract new users and to meet diverse travel needs as we go forward. I mentioned about cars already. We need to make sure that the car-based recovery isn't inevitable. We need to do everything we can to encourage people and show people and demonstrate to people why a car shouldn't be and isn't necessary to live and work in London these days. Complementing walking and cycling, I think in the past there's perhaps been a characterisation that there's a sort of battle going on between us. Of course, there is limited road space in London. There's no point in denying that. We have a very old city with very limited road space. We need to do the best we can within that space there to deliver better neighbourhoods and to make places more attractive. And having less car dominance on high streets will make it more attractive for walking and cycling as well. And we end up with a virtuous circle, if we're careful here and we get this right, in making high streets and town centres a more attractive place for all to go to. And we need to enable development, healthy development in London, new housing, new jobs. Population, of course, has gone down or looks like it's gone down in the last year or so as a result of COVID, and the growth that we are expecting of London to grow will, of course, have stalled as a result of COVID, but we do hope and expect that London will grow again in the future. So we need to be ready for that. So our vision is to have bus travel as a zero carbon option that more Londoners choose to use. It's part of a comprehensive, active and sustainable transport network. So the next slide then sort of sets out how we want to approach this. So we are drafting a bus action plan. It complements the existing action plans for example, cycling and other activities that we do. And it sits within the Mayor's transport strategy to set out the role that buses have to play. And a lot of the elements within the bus action plan are things that we are already doing to an extent. But what the bus action plan is aiming to do, would set out, is how these things all come together and how they come together to deliver a picture that we believe is where the bus network should be in 2030. So with a caveat around funding still, that a number of these things do take funding, but not all of them do. Some of them are really around how we approach these things together. So we've created 5 broad categories in which we believe we should address the issues and within the bus action plan. So Jeff has talked around journey times, and that's front and centre here because our customers tell us that is the most important thing in all of our research. Of course, at the moment, they're worried about cleanliness and people wearing face coverings, but even in a COVID world, they're still telling us that reliability and journey times are the single most important thing to them. So getting that right is fundamental to customer satisfaction. We need to ensure that the customer experience remains inclusive. We need to make sure that people feel safe and secure on the network. There's the core safety of making sure that we have fewer accidents and people are less likely to get injured on or by a bus. But we clearly need to make sure that people feel safe and secure, not only on the bus, but also when waiting at bus stops and as part of their journey as well. And clearly some of the really horrible incidents over the last year, for example, Sarah Everard and amongst others, we need to recognise that women and girls' safety, but also teenagers' safety is really important and a way that we can help enable those people to feel safe to travel around London. We need to continue to make sure that the bus network, Jeff's team, and more widely, we continue to make sure the bus network goes where it needs to go to. People want to go to shops, so buses need to continue to serve high streets. People want to go to stations and interchange. So we need to make sure that there are easy ways of people getting between buses and rail stations, good wayfinding, stops that are nearby, and so on. So to make that interchange easy. And of course, decarbonisation. From our perspective, and we also need to be ready for the impacts of climate change on the network and how it affects us. So that's what the Bus Action Plan is aiming to set out across these areas here, and we're continuing to work on that and develop that soon, with the aim of publishing that before too long, hopefully in the new year, and we can share more details there. So on to my final slide, the summary. And sort of points to take away from today is really the fundamental one is that Londoners depend on London's bus network. All of our residents, whether you're a representative of borough or a user group here today, Londoners depend on the bus network, and they're front and central, crucial to London's recovery from the pandemic. There is still a concern, of course, around funding, and the lack of certainty of funding is an issue. And we need to hopefully get through the current funding discussions, and we need to get a longer term funding settlement, because the short term 6-month funding settlements make it really difficult to make decisions that in many cases are long term. Buses have got a 14-year asset life cycle. Infrastructure projects, frequently the good ones, the ones with the most benefit, take much longer than 6 months to develop and then build. We can build bus priority relatively quickly in certain local cases, but to do the really good stuff like Harrow Road's example that Jeff used earlier on, that takes a number of probably years to actually develop that from beginning to fully implemented, to make sure that we take on board all of the issues and we work with all of the stakeholders to make that delivered. So having funding certainty helps us deliver those big schemes as well. And it's continued collaboration with stakeholders. We know that we need to speak more clearly and openly. We need to listen and hear more about what people tell us. And we need to go out and talk to a wider group of people than perhaps we have in the past. There are lots of very great technical experts and leads among stakeholder groups, but we need to perhaps talk to a wider group of officers in planning and in regeneration teams. We need to consider whether we talk to local councillors rather than perhaps just the lead on transport in a borough, because of course those councillors are a great channel and possibly a great advocate to the people that live in those boroughs as well. So those are kind of the 3 elements that we want to take forward now. As I said, a bus action plan is on its way. We hope to be able to publish that early next year. And with that, I think I'm going to hand back to Emma.
Thank you very much, Tom and Jeff. That was really interesting. And yeah, thank you very much for those slides. It was really fascinating talk. And I'm hoping that in a moment I'll be able to pass over to Dominic West, who's the lead officer for public transport at the London Borough of Hackney. Now, Dominic's been having a few internet issues, so I'm really hoping that when I pass over to him in a moment, you will hear his voice, but you won't be able to see him because he's had to turn his video off so that we can hear his sound properly. Dominic, are you there to give us a perspective from the London boroughs?
Yes, good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much, Emma, for inviting me to attend to represent the boroughs. As I think has been said, we're responsible for 95% of the road network in London. And but having said that, the 5% of the TLRN is actually also very important because it does carry very heavy numbers of bus passengers. So perhaps if I can just move on to my first slide.
Go ahead, Dominic. Yeah.
Can't actually see the presentation, but is it on the screen?
Yeah, I think you'll just have to trust that your slides are there, Dominic, even though you can't see them.
Well, if basically, if we can go on to the first slide, and if we can go to see how it all began, we really have to start in 1968 actually, when the GLC was introducing bus lanes. The first bus lanes to be introduced in London were at Hyde Park Corner and at Vauxhall. Very revolutionary in the 1960s to actually take away some of the car space and introduce bus lanes. Those bus lanes actually operated between 4 and 7 in the afternoon, just for the afternoon peak. That was the first experiment in bus lanes. And then, of course, the GLC throughout the 60s, 70s, up to abolition, was introducing very, very pro-public transport and was introducing a lot of bus priority measures, some very controversial, but some very good bus priority measures were introduced across London, which contributed a lot to improving reliability on the bus network. Moving on to the next slide, and we have the boroughs working in partnership. The London Bus Priority Network was something which was set up after the abolition of the GLC. It was realised that there was no strategic authority for London, and that there really ought to be a way in which boroughs working together in partnership could continue to do the work of the GLC and could continue to introduce bus priority. That was set up through Steve Norris, who is a very pro public transport minister, and the Government Office for London, and 5 areas of London were selected. Five areas were selected to run bus priority across London. There were 5 areas, five area coordinators. I was a sector leader for the Northeast London, representing 9 boroughs, and we were able between us to introduce lots of bus priority measures. I think the heyday of the London Bus Priority Network was in the 1990s, late 1990s. I think in 1996, 97, in that year, we introduced about 80 bus lanes across the whole of London in 1 year. So that was quite an achievement. And then there was also linked to that, there was the London Bus Initiative, which was initially looking at improving the whole routes on 27 bus routes in London. Lots of measures went in to improve the reliability of the bus service and to focus on individual routes across the boroughs. A lot of those measures are still in today. So moving on to the Hackney context now. Hackney is a very pro public transport borough. Hackney is a very pro cycling borough, and Hackney is a very pro walking borough. We regard ourselves as a very, very sustainable borough. 80% of trips are made by walking, cycling, or public transport. So I think we've already exceeded the Mayor's target of 2041. 48 school streets and 16 new low traffic neighbourhoods. There is very strong political support in Hackney for public transport. The Mayor uses the bus. He also cycles and walks, as do many of our councillors. We have a lot of deprived wards in the borough where a lot of residents and workers are heavily reliant on public transport, particularly the bus, especially those on low incomes, and especially night buses as well. I want to make a plug for night buses. Night buses are not only are they important for the local nighttime economy, but they're also important to get those on low wages, those who work in the service sectors, hospitality, catering, security. Those workers rely on the night buses to take them to work, and I think night bus usage is higher amongst the low wage earners than it is in the nighttime economy. That was certainly the case pre-pandemic, and I imagine it's still the same today. So a plug here for night buses. Night buses also tend to run longer distance, so people can make longer trips on those for a fraction of the cost, and they travel at times when there's less congestion. So they are very, very useful and a boon to those who rely on them to get to and from work. Moving on to Hackney's approach to bus priority. We had a review of all our bus lanes in 2015. We've got 20 bus lanes in Hackney over approximately 5 kilometres of the borough. And the view basically was taken, well, what can we do to improve our bus lanes? Should we put in more bus lanes? Should we expand our bus lanes? Should we change the hours of operation? But one thing we're particularly keen to do was to look at their operation at weekends. And it's interesting that if we actually look at how bus ridership has changed post-pandemic, although we understand that the number of people using buses has gone up steadily, it's still well below the pre-pandemic level. But interestingly enough, weekend bus use, particularly on Sundays, has gone up quite a lot, and it's pretty near where it was before the pandemic. So with that in mind, we're very keen that the buses should be protected on the streets of Hackney, not just on Monday to Fridays, but also on Saturdays and Sundays. Moving on, as I said, I think hours of operations of bus lanes are quite crucial on that. We've got bus lanes that operate in the morning peak, in the afternoon peak. We've got bus lanes that operate all day, particularly where there are pre-signals and bus priority activated devices. But we've been thinking about how we could improve bus flows in areas where the bus lanes, perhaps the hours of operation may be a little bit out of date. And this is a particular example on Mare Street. We have a bus lane that operates into peak, morning peak and afternoon peak. But we have found issues with congestion occurring at lunchtime. So what we are doing is extending the hours from 7 till 7 to give protection to the bus during the majority of the working day. Moving on, small measures. Small measures can often bring great benefits. As you'll see from this picture, the bus is stuck in traffic because there are parked cars on both sides of the road. So simple solution, next slide please, is to introduce waiting and loading restrictions. We've done the same with removing parking bays. Again, it's often the case that there are lots of small pinch points on roads on the network, and it doesn't need a strategy, it doesn't need a workshop, it just needs small measures. By taking out some parking bays at key pinch points, you can help buses flow, and we found that to be a real success. So it's the little things that matter, not just the big things. And I do urge everyone who's trying to improve the role of the bus and the borough to actually be aware of all the local issues, to know your network, talk to the operators, go out on site, see what's happening, and hopefully you'll be able to propose some changes which will make a difference to London's bus service. Moving on, another challenge is what happens on the borough boundary, the boundaries with other boroughs. And it's often the case that boroughs will look at their own network in isolation, but not be aware of the impact of what's happening in another borough. And I think it's important that we do talk to our adjoining boroughs, that we work jointly together to ensure that what we're introducing in one borough doesn't have a negative impact on the other borough. And ideally, if the boroughs can jointly promote schemes which benefit both boroughs, then there's a benefit all round. To give you an example, the slide on the left shows Balls Pond Road, which is the boundary between Hackney and Islington. We recently took out a small section of bus lane, not something I was particularly keen to do, but there were other benefits, there were cycling benefits in removing that bus lane. What we should have done is actually looked at the Islington bus lane further along, where you can see there is some traffic congestion because it only operates into peak. There would have been the opportunity to remove parking on the Hackney side of the road to actually allow Islington to extend the hours of operation of that bus lane and to extend the length of it. And it's a shame that opportunity was missed. However, it is something that I think we need to discuss with Islington and to see if we can actually bring that suggestion forward. Similarly, the next two pictures show the borough boundary on Hackney Road with Hackney and Tower Hamlets. Again, we have an interpeak bus lane in Tower Hamlets, which should really be operational 7 till 7. As you can see, there's lots of traffic in between the peak hours, and it would benefit from operating 7 till 7 during the working day. There's also a couple of parking bays, which you can see right on the approach to the junction with Queensbridge Road, blocking the ahead lane. And because there's a very busy right turn, buses do tail back quite a while there. So again, by simply removing those two parking bays on one side of the road, you clear a major blockage and you substantially improve bus reliability on a very busy bus corridor. That's Hackney Road. Moving on to the next slide. Yes, bus lane discipline. This is something which is quite close to my heart. If you're going to put in a bus lane, and lots of buses are going to use it, the last thing you need is buses to be hanging around in the bus lane for 5 minutes because they're being held to time. Another one of my great annoyances. Or worse still, they're changing drivers. And it's not unusual in that bus lane to see a bus stay there for about 5 minutes because the bus is early. The relief driver hasn't turned up, and the impact of that bus being stuck in the bus lane for 5 minutes will cause delay to the rest of the buses that are using the bus lanes. I agree it's a difficult one, but I would urge TfL, when they award contracts to bus companies, to bus operators, to be mindful of where the drivers will change, to try to dissuade them from any instances where buses change crews in operational bus lanes, because it does defeat the whole point of the bus lane, and it annoys quite a few people as well. So food for thought on that one. Moving on, another big issue for bus service reliability is the impact on roadworks. It's something that I get a lot of calls about from operators on a daily basis. In fact, it's probably the most of the emails I get and phone messages are to do with roadworks. Why have we allowed Thames Water to dig up the road at the same time as the gas board are down the road? Well, we try and do what we can. We have to facilitate emergency roadworks, but there's a lot we can do with the long-term planning of roadworks. And what we have done in Hackney, and I think this is something which I'm quite proud of, is we've managed to share roadworks with individual utility companies. To give you an example, we had a major closure of Graham Road last week. We didn't allow the road to be closed at first. We put in a diversion. The diversion clearly was causing absolute chaos. Buses were losing 90 minutes in the evening peak. It was having a massive impact on the network. So we decided to, almost within 24 hours, implement Plan B, close Graham Road, tell the contractor that you've only got a day to do the work, 2 days to do the work, and as a result of that, Graham Road reopened. We also had a big issue with a skip parked in Graham Road for a year or two, and this took so much officer time, and the chief executive went mad. It was raised by the mayor. It was a high-profile issue. So moving on, where do we go from here? Well, I think the other big issue now is what happens between buses and cyclists. This is an issue that's come up recently, and I think it's something we can talk about perhaps towards the end. But there is a there's a role for cyclists and there's a role for buses. I'm conscious that historically cyclists have always been allowed to use bus lanes, and that's been a benefit for cyclists. But of course, there's now a different cycling agenda, and London has lost lots of bus lanes because of cyclists. So I think my message is, please don't take out too many bus lanes, but please think about the bus as well as the cycle. And I think the last slide, that's Lee Bridge Road. We're looking to actually do bus and cycling measures in Lee Bridge Road, a key corridor where we actually keep the cycle lane, keep the bus lanes and introduce cycle lanes as well. So it's the best of both worlds. And finally, my last slide. Well, I think that sums up London during the pandemic, that the poor old bus has lost its bus lane, and the bus lane is just there, lost forever. Big issue with London's bridges. We've lost a lot of bus priority on London's bridges. As traffic is building up, as congestion is building up, the bus is going to increasingly need to be protected on London's bridges as well as on London's network. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dominic. That was a really, really interesting presentation, and I really appreciated your honesty as well about where maybe things could have gone better, like where you've taken out a section of bus lane and maybe it would have been better to do something else. I really, really appreciate that. So just before we go into the Q&A discussion, and there's quite a few questions coming through, just to let you know that the Daily Telegraph have just published an article about this summit that we're doing right now, including the kind of the savings figures that Jeff Hobbs mentioned on how we can make savings through improving conditions for the buses on our roads. So have a look at that. So I'm now going to invite Jeff, Tom and Dominic to answer some questions about what we've heard. I think some of the questions that have come through have usefully been answered by the presentations, but we've definitely got a few that haven't. So we're going to move over to that Q&A session now for the next kind of 25 minutes. So I think, something that's interesting and talked about a little bit in one of your presentations was around the benefit of the bus to the high street. And obviously that's incredibly important. Statistically, Department for Transport says that the 1 in 4 of all bus journeys relate to shopping. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are, Dominic, and I'll bring in Jeff or Tom as well if you've got something to say on that, about how can local bus journeys help to revitalise the high street? Dominic first, is there anything you want to say on that? Yes,
I think increasingly the bus is very important for the high street. I think if you look at somewhere like Oxford Street, I've been following the Oxford Street debacle for many years. The view was always that the bus took people directly to the shops, and there was always TfL and London buses historically always resisted removing buses down Oxford Street. In fact, Peter Hendy, I think, was on record was saying it would happen over his dead body. Well, moving on perhaps 10-15 years, and quite a number of buses have been removed from Oxford Street. I'm a bit saddened that TfL has caved in on that one. Appreciate it's Westminster's road, and if I'm upsetting Westminster, then well, that's so be it. But buses do need to serve the shopping centre. No problem with reducing the number of bus routes, but let's not have lots of short bus routes. Let's have long bus routes, so that instead of having 10 bus routes running down Oxford Street, link up the routes, extend bus routes so that they can have longer journeys. And I think this is something that TfL may have to do in the context of a bus review. So yes, I do want to see buses serve shopping centres. Oxford Street's an example, but you have to get the balance right.
Thanks very much for that. Jeff, would you like to come in on that one, Jeff?
Yeah, just to say that in the past we've done research on what kind of spend different people make going into different town centres by different modes of transport. And it might surprise people to hear that shopping spend on the high street is, I think it's the highest on the buses at £32 per head. This was a few years ago, 5 or 6 years ago. So inflation will make a bit of a difference since then. But nonetheless, that's quite a remarkable outcome that bus users make quite such heavy users of the high street, and that's part of our case, the economic case, if you like, for why we should continue to run a comprehensive bus service in and around London to all its town centres.
Thanks very much for that, Jeff. So we've had a question come in about, how can we improve coordination between TfL and the boroughs on bus lanes, low traffic neighbourhoods, etc., and combined public consultations. And just kind of going back to Dominic's presentation, where Dominic, you talked about the London. Oh, I've written it down in the wrong place on my bit of paper, but the London Bus Priority Network, I think you called it. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are. I'll ask Dominic first, and then I'll bring in Jeff and Tom on whether you think that a similar initiative would be good to introduce now, some kind of better kind of coordination to really put some energy behind this issue.
Yes, that's an interesting question, Emma. I think the way TfL works for my dealings with them is they're very fragmented and they're very compartmentalized. I mean, that's not a criticism, that's probably just a way the organisation works. And we find in the boroughs that we're dealing with one team on this and one team on that. And I think the answer really is to try and have some sort of borough representative. And to be honest, that is happening. So you have a representative who is responsible for your borough at TfL, who is fully aware of everything that the borough is doing with TfL, be it cycling, be it walking, be it bus priority. I think if those officers within TfL can be encouraged to take a holistic view in discussions with the borough, then you're some way to actually getting a coordinated approach that's multimodal and that promotes the sustainable transport modes as well. So I really looked at TfL's organisation to try and help the boroughs to work in partnership with us.
Thanks for that. I don't know if Jeff or Tom want to come in on that one with a view.
Yeah, just a small comment. I'll pick one which Dominic should hopefully sympathise with. So we've worked with, hardly a day goes by when I'm not on the phone to Dominic, and probably knows to his cost. Maybe a small amount of hyperbole, but not much there. And one of the many things which we work with him on is Stoke Newington gyratory and changes there, which have immense impact for buses, and where I think we have tried to work with him and other relevant boroughs in the consequences of the changes in that neck of the woods. Dominic mentioned also quite rightly Oxford Street, where we are indeed obliged to work with City of Westminster, who remain keen to change the road layout in and around Oxford Circus. So as a result, we are obliged to change the bus network accordingly. So I think we do our very best, but there's a lot of issues, and a lot of the bus stop issues are indeed extremely local. So every now and again, it might just be that we're overwhelmed, but we do our best.
Okay. Tom, is there anything you want to add?
I think I was just going to add to the point. Yeah, yes, bus routes don't stop at borough boundaries. So Dominic's absolutely right that we do need to think around where those interfaces take place and make sure that when we're designing improvements to whatever mode it might be, and ideally it should be a holistic approach to a corridor which looks at walking, cycling, buses, and servicing those people that need servicing along the route to ensure those businesses carry on. But we need to look at them when they do cross the boundary, and I think Dominic's highlighted some really good cases where that has worked, but I think there are also some places where that hasn't worked so well, and we need to find a way in which we can manage that better. But it's by talking, and it's about addressing these problems that we need to do so. And I think looking at some of the points in the wider chat as well, and the comments there, yes, I think sometimes we and boroughs have focused on a particular outcome, it being a cycling scheme or a bus priority scheme or a something else scheme, And actually what we need to do now is take that holistic view and step back and look at what are the overall, what do we want to get out of that junction? What do we want to get out of that bit of road? And what's the best way in which we can do that, which will almost certainly mean nobody getting exactly what they want, but everybody or every interest getting some of what they want. And it's those difficult conversations that we need to facilitate and encourage, and recognise that sometimes we're going to have fall out over things, I suspect, but we need to actually then come back together again and find a solution that is actually going to work on the ground.
Thanks very much, Tom, and your comments kind of reflecting some of the questions and thoughts coming through on the chat. That somebody's saying walking is fundamental to bus use. Should it get more priority, maybe promoted along with the buses, which is certainly something that you've all addressed in your presentations. So I've got another question for Dominic now. You went into a lot of really useful detail about the things that you've done in Hackney, the very, very kind of practical things that you've done in Hackney to let the bus flow more freely. And I'm really, really impressed that you're up to kind of 87% of journeys made by sustainable means. That's a very impressive statistic. And I just wondered if you had some advice to other boroughs who were thinking about focusing more on how to free the bus. What would your top tips be to them? What should their starting points be? And I appreciate that money's tight at the moment and there are a lot of uncertainties around funding, but what would your starting point be?
Thanks, Emma. Well, that's an interesting one. I mean, I look around me and I see very much an inner London versus outer London debate here. We're quite fortunate in Hackney being an inner London borough where the number of where car ownership is actually being reduced because people are finding that it's actually quite pleasant to shop locally, to walk locally, to cycle locally, and to use the bus to go to town or to a shopping centre. And in contrast to that, I've seen, Tom and I don't live far from each other, we've seen West London congestion increase exponentially. So I think it's very much there is a polarisation here. There is a difference between the inner London and outer London. It's probably more of a challenge in outer London to get people out of their cars than it is in inner London. We're fortunate in Hackney, we've been able to do it because of the type of borough that we are. But that is definitely a challenge.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. Jeff or Tom, is there anything that you want to add on that one, on kind of top tips or starting points? I appreciate you don't want to tell boroughs what to do, but you might have some thoughts of your own.
Yeah, inner versus outer is a slightly crude characterization, but it helps to at least summarize the nature of the debate and how things do differ in terms of how buses operate, the nature of the market, the scale of the near market, if I can use that jargon, and the difference in the pattern of usage and the scale of usage. Certainly, the bus usage is materially lower in many outer London boroughs than places like Hackney and other places in inner London. So as a result, we do try to tailor our response accordingly, which is more nuanced than mere inner versus outer, but has some of that characteristic.
Thanks very much for that. We're getting some kind of questions and thoughts coming in, and they've some of them are on a similar theme. So we had a comment that buses must serve places that passengers want to go, and the question is, do TfL know the answer post-pandemic? Are there outer London routes, for example, that are now higher priority because of new working patterns? I'm just going to wrap up a few of these questions, and you can kind of address them as you want to. There's a comment that's saying much of this discussion is about TfL talking to boroughs but not talking to local communities. What do they want? So I think there's a kind of a link there, maybe with the new travel patterns. And there's also a question that's come in as saying, are bus passengers switching to e-scooters, and if so, how many? So I don't know, Tom or Jeff, I don't know if you want to put a kind of basket of things there to address, but whether one of you wants to kind of come in first on that.
So do we know what the changes in patterns are? I think was sort of the gist of the question.
Yes, and does that mean that there are maybe kind of new routes in outer London that need to be given kind of a higher priority? And there's been a discussion before, hasn't there, about potentially orbital bus routes, taking people from borough to borough rather than coming into the kind of centre of town.
So we've recently added really quite a lot of capacity on orbital bus routes. So in 2019, for example, pre-pandemic, we added I think it's 7 or 8 new routes in different places across capital in all points of the compass. We also extended a whole load of routes. Pick one outer London borough completely at random. Barnet, for example, we have extended Route 112, which is at the south end of the borough around Finchley, Route 125, which is in the middle of the borough between Colindale and places like that, and Route 384 at the top of the borough between Barnet and Edgware. And what we also know is the different rates of recovery of demand post-pandemic. And certainly we see the rate of recovery, which is about 75% network-wide, being faster in quite a few outer London boroughs. Generally tends to be a bit faster in East London as well, but then demand never fell quite so much in parts of those parts of London like that to begin with. But what we are seeing, it's not as if demand is above 100% of the pandemic or pre-pandemic anywhere at the moment, or indeed particularly close to that. But yes, the pattern of trips is changing. We've got a decent, if far from exhaustive, finger on what's going on. There was a specific question about e-scooters, which make a small difference, but not really material to date in terms of the volume of trips on buses. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks for that, Jeff. Tom, is there anything you wanted to add?
I think the point about wider stakeholder engagement is right. We talk particularly around boroughs because they're probably the first port to call for a lot of the decisions around how roads are managed and how roadworks are put in and how schemes are designed. But understanding what communities are looking for is important, and we've got a team that do that. I think it's really difficult to necessarily do what everyone wants, and I think that's the challenge we've all got, is that sometimes we need to understand what people want. We need to evaluate the evidence as we do with our consultations. And sometimes we change our consultations and sometimes we don't. We do listen to what people say, and we try to be honest about the reasons why we can't do what people have asked us to do. There are often really good ideas out there. There are different ways in which we could do things. And we, in our team and in Jeff's team, need to make some difficult decisions about which one we're going to go for. And we can't please everyone all of the time. Our aim is to try and do the right thing for as many people as we possibly can.
Thanks very much, Tom. Dominic, is there anything that you want to kind of add onto this kind of set of questions about meeting passengers' new needs? Anything about e-scooters that I'm not sure if you're trialling them in your borough, actually, I should know that. But is there anything you want to add, Dominic?
Thanks, Emma. Yes, just to say that on the issue of e-scooters, we haven't signed up to the trial in Hackney because we do have serious safety concerns about their use. My perception of e-scooter users is that they're mainly young and mobile, so I don't think that many of those e-scooter riders are being pinched from the bus network. But as I say, our main concern is that this is a new problem which we could have done without, quite frankly.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Yes, the divides opinion e-scooters, and obviously the kind of trial's still ongoing, so we're yet to kind of see the results back from that. So I've had a question through about bus gates, and as you I think you, Dominic, described a bus gate as a stretch of road for buses cycling and walking only. There are some of them in London, but I'm just wondering why there aren't more of them and what the kind of barriers are to introducing them. Jeff, do you want to go first on that one?
Sure, yes. Bus gates can bring forth some strong emotions. So people like me think they are a work of wonder. There are many people who would disagree with that, more often car users. So obviously an implication of a bus gate is that some through routes, often direct ones, no longer are for car users, and road capacity is reduced. And that often brings forth those sorts of comments in the consultation associated with this. Less impactful, but still a fact, is that bus gates need space. Space is sometimes scarce. Sometimes it comes at the expense, again, of other users, be it cycle lanes, be it parking, be it loading. And road space in London is at a premium. So again, the mere practicalities of this, the feasibility of it, can sometimes mean that bus gates are easier said than done. And both those reasons help to explain why there aren't as many as certainly people like me would like.
Thanks very much for that. Dominic, is there anything additional that you want to say from your experience about bus gates, or any advice to your colleagues in other boroughs about introducing them?
I think bus gates were a product of the 80s and 90s, really. The discussion now about the street is probably a bit wider, because we have to accommodate, as Jeff says, more sustainable modes within a restricted piece of street. They probably still work fine in areas where you have the opportunity to devote space for bus priority, but we have to bear in mind the changing world and the fact that there's a limited amount of street space, and it's making the best use of that street space to optimize all but cycling, walking, and public transport. But they've still got a role, but in the right place.
Okay, thanks very much for that. I've got another one for you, Dominic, and probably for Jeff or Tom as well, actually, and it's around, in your presentation, Dominic, you were talking about the things that you can do to, like, for example, kind of introducing waiting and loading restrictions, removing parking bays. And I'm just wondering about what the role is of enforcing parking restrictions. As we saw in our short film, there are times when people are parking in bus lanes, parking on double yellow lines. What's the role there for boroughs, particularly to do kind of better enforcement, and how do you think that helps kind of free up space for the bus?
Is that one to me, Emma?
Sorry, Dominic. Yes, that's to you first. Okay,
well, I think that's a very important point. Ironically, I was on a call recently with TfL where they were explaining to us the introduction of their 24-hour bus lanes, which Hackney fully support. I think I mentioned this earlier on, although it's only the TfL network is only 5%, it's still a crucial 5%. And Hackney has benefited immensely from the introduction of 24-hour bus lanes, particularly along the A10 through Stoke Newington and Stamford Hill. The problem we've got is, and I did raise the question, I said to TfL, it's fine having 24-hour bus lanes, but of course you don't enforce them on a 24-hour basis. You don't enforce them in the evening, for instance, and we've had issues around Shoreditch pre-pandemic with the nighttime economy, where cabs and private cars were blocking bus lanes. And when I tried to get TfL to do something about it, I was told, well, actually, we don't enforce after 1900. So it is a very important point. There's no point in having a 24-hour bus lane if you're not going to be enforcing it 24 hours. What we do in Hackney is that we do have a dedicated resource for bus lanes. It's taken seriously. It's considered as part of the entire enforcement of the borough. And I can call on to the parking enforcement team 24/7, and they will deal with any obstructions in bus lanes and on bus stops in the borough.
Thanks very much for that. Jeff or Tom, do you want to kind of comment on that. And I mean, there's also a kind of a question or a comment that came in, which is why not make all bus lanes 24/7 and make it clear to drivers that they should never drive in them. But I'm just kind of adding that one in. But yes, is there anything more to say about parking enforcement, but also if you want to say anything about 24/7 bus lanes, Jeff or Tom?
So on 24-hour bus lanes, I mean, again, this would, well, my answer is the same as the business case that I discussed earlier, that it would do great things for the bus network. However, the Jobsworth answer is that whilst we have a trial on the main TfL strategic road network, bus lanes, the vast majority of bus lanes are on borough roads, and therefore the Jobsworth answer, rather inadequate though it might well be, is that is a matter for individual boroughs. Hackney have 24-hour bus lanes, and we're delighted with that. Other boroughs have chosen to do that as well. Not all have, and there are always exceptions to make the rule because of particular local circumstances as well, given all the sort of parking and loading that necessarily goes on with certain types of shops and local sensitivities. So then there's about enforcement. Well, there's only so much resource for enforcement. You can either do it through people or you can do it through cameras. We can always try and increase that. It has to be said, given the financial constraints, it's quite hard to do that. Having said that, there are always ways of innovating so we can get the proverbial quart out of a pint pot, particularly with the next generation of cameras. We have to make sure, though, that those cameras meet standards which are set out nationwide, so that there's again, may not be a particularly satisfactory answer, but it is nonetheless the case that we have to go through due process before innovating too hard and too fast in this sort of quarter. So yes, all sorts of constraints, I'm afraid.
Okay, thanks very much. So go ahead, Tom.
I was going to say, and I think, I'd like to call out Ealing, who have done a particularly good job with some 24-hour bus lanes on some of their key roads as well. And not only has that improved things for buses, but actually on one section of road near me, it got rid of, I think it was 4 different hours of operation in about a mile-long stretch along the road. So, as an occasional car driver, that's a really confusing scenario to be put into as a driver about, should I be in the bus lane now or not? And the reason that's important is that when traffic is bad, if a bus can't get to the start of the bus lane, then it's held up as well. So there are times actually where we do need to consider whether the 24-hour bus lane is absolutely the right idea. I think it's a really strong message if we can do it, but we do need to make sure the bus can get to the bus lane past the end of the queue of the traffic for whatever other purpose it is there for. And that really comes down to then making sure that we have an attractive option that means that people choose to use the car less or choose not to own a car, because it's really by reducing congestion on the roads that we can improve the speeds and make the service more attractive in the virtuous circle that you highlighted and Trevor highlighted at the start of the session.
Thanks very much for that. Well, we're starting to run out of time now. I will just pass on a comment that's come from the MD of a bus company saying making bus routes longer will impact on driver hours, legislation fatigue and work-life balance. So I'm just kind of throwing that comment in there. There was also a question that we couldn't get to, but is possibly more one for the Mayor really, is can ULEZ be used to restrain traffic and help the progress of the bus? But I think we're going to have to draw things to a close now. And so I'm very sorry if I didn't get to your questions or your comments. I just finding the right paper. I want to say a big thank you to Jeff, Tom and Dominic. Really, really appreciate you giving up your time and for your insight today. I think you'll agree with me that it's been really helpful for us in understanding what the issues are, what the challenges are and the opportunities are for the bus. And I'd also want to say a huge thank you to everybody watching and for those of you who sent in questions. And just a reminder that we will share with you the link to the Day in the Life of the Bus video and also the briefing paper on the savings that could be made from better bus efficiency. And this is just the beginning of our work to help clear the way for the bus. And we're looking forward to talking to you more about this as we follow it up in the new year. So thank you very much again to everybody.